Hello everyone, welcome back to part 8 of the Anglo Saxon Chronicle. Here we are at 1066 now. I'm sure you all know what happens there, so no need for introductions. Let's just continue. AD 1066. This year came King Harald from York to Westminster, on the Easter succeeding the midwinter, when the King Edward died. Easter was then on the 16th day before the calends of May. Then was over all England such a token seen as no man ever saw before. Some men said it was the comet star, which others denominated the long-haired star. It appeared first on the eve called Litania Major, that is, on the 8th before the calends of May, and so shone all the week. Soon after this came Earl Tosti from beyond the sea into the Isle of Wight, with as large a fleet as he could get, and he was there supplied with money and provisions. Thence he proceeded, and committed outrages by the sea coast, where he could land until he came to Sandwich, when it was told King Harold, who was in London, that his brother Tosti had come to Sandwich, gathered so large a force, naval and military, as no king before collected in this land, for it was credibly reported that Earl William from Normandy, King Edward's cousin, would come hither and gain this land, just as it afterwards happened. When Tosti understood that King Harold was on the way to Sandwich, he departed thence, and took some of the boatmen with him, willing and unwilling, and went into the Humber with 60 ships, whence he plundered in Lindsey, and slew a good many men. When the Earls Edwin and Morcar understood that, they came hither, and drove him from the land, and the boatmen forsook him, and he went to Scotland with 12 smacks, and the King of the Scots entertained him, and aided him with provisions, and he abode there all the summer. There met him Harald, King of Norway, with 300 ships, and Tosti submitted to him, and became his man. Then came King Harold to Sandwich, where he awaited his fleet, for it was long ere it could be collected. But when it was assembled, he went into the Isle of Wight, and there lay all the summer and the autumn. There it was also a land force everywhere by sea, though it availed naught in the end. It was now the nativity of St. Mary, when the provisioning of the men began, and no man could keep them there any longer. They therefore had to leave to go home, and the king rode up, and the ships were driven to London, but many of them perished ere they came thither. When the ships had come home, then came Harald, King of Norway, north into the Tyne unawares, with a very great sea force, no small one, that might be with 300 ships or more, and Earl Tosti came to him with all these he had got, just as they had before said, and they both went up with all the fleet alongside the Ouse toward York. When it was told King Harold in the south, after he had come from the ships, that Harold, King of Norway, and Earl Tosti were come up near York, then he went northward by day and night, as soon as he could collect his army. But ere Harold could come thither, the Earls Edwin and Morcar had gathered from their earldoms as great a force as they could get, and fought with the enemy. They made great slaughter too, but there was a good number of English people slain and drowned and put to flight, and the Northmen had possession of the field of battle. It was then told Harold, King of the English, that this thus had happened. At this fight was on the eve of St. Matthew the Apostle, which was Wednesday. Then, after the fight, went Harald, King of Norway, and Earl Tosti into York with as many followers as they could fit. And having procured hostages and provisions from the city, they proceeded to their ships and proclaimed full friendship, on condition that all would go southward with them and gain this land. In the midst came Harold, King of the English, with his army on the Sunday to Tadcaster, where he collected his fleet. Thence he proceeded on Monday throughout York. But Harold, King of Norway, and Earl Tosti with their forces were gone from their ships beyond York to Stamford Bridge, for it was given to them to understand that hostages would be brought to them there from all the shires. Thither came Harold, King of the English, unawares again beyond the bridge, and they closed together there, and continued long in the day fighting severely. There was slain Harold the fair-haired, King of Norway, and Earl Tosti, and a multitude of people with them, both Normans and English. And the Normans that were left fled from the English, who slew them hotly behind, until some came to their ships. Some were drowned, some burned to death, and thus variously destroyed, so that there was very little left, and the English gained possession of the field. But there was one of the Norwegians who withstood the English, so that they could not pass over the bridge, nor complete a victory. An Englishman aimed at him with a javelin, but it availed nothing. Then came another under the bridge, who pierced him terribly inwards under the coat of mail. And Harold, the King of the English, then came over the bridge followed by his army, and there they made a great slaughter, both of the Norwegians and of the Flemings. But Harold let the king's son Edmund go home to Norway with all the ships. He also gave quarter to Olav, the Norwegian king's son, and to their bishop, and to the Earl of the Orkneys, and to those who were left in the ships, who then went up to the king, and took oaths that they would ever maintain faith and friendship unto this land. Whereupon the king let them go home with 24 ships. These 2 general battles were fought within 5 nights. Meantime, Earl William came up from Normandy into Pevensey on the eve of St. Michael's Mass, and soon after his landing was effected, they constructed a castle at the port of Hastings. This was then told to King Harold, and he gathered a large force, and came to meet him at the estuary of Appledore. However, William came against him unawares ere his army was collected, but the king, nevertheless, very hardly encountered with the men that would support him, and there was great slaughter made on either side. There was slain King Harold, and Leofwin his brother, and Earl Gurth his brother, with many good men, and the Frenchmen gained the field of battle, as God granted them for the sins of this nation. Archbishop Eldred and the Corporation of London were then desirous of having Child Edgar to king, as he was quite natural to them, and Edwin and Morcar promised them that they would fight with them. But the more prompt the business should ever be, so it was from day to day the latter and worse, as in the end it all fared. This battle was fought on the day of Pope Calixtus, and Earl William returned to Hastings, and waited there to know whether the people would submit to him. But when he found that they would not come to him, he went and set up all his force that was left, and came to him since then from oversea, and ravaged all the country that he overran, until he came to Berkhamsted, where Archbishop Eldred came to meet him, with Child Edgar and Earls Edwin and Morcar, and all the best men from London, who submitted then for need, when the most harm was already done. It was very ill advised that they do so before, seeing God would not better things for our sins. And they gave him hostages, and took oaths, and they promised them that he would be a faithful lord to them. Though in the midst of this, they plundered wherever they went. Then on Midwinter's Day, Archbishop Eldred hallowed him to a king at Westminster, and gave him possession with the books of Christ, and also swore him, ere that he would set the crown upon his head, that he would so well govern this nation as any before him best did, if they would be faithful to him. Nevertheless, he laid very heavy tribute upon men, and in Lent went over the sea to Normandy, taking with him Archbishop Stigand, and Abbot Aylnoth of Glastonbury, and the child Edgar, and the Earls Edwin, Morcar, and Waltheof, and many other good men of England. Bishop Odo and Earl William lived here afterwards, and wrought castles widely throughout this country, and harassed the miserable people, and ever since has evil increased very much. May the end be good, when God will. In that same expedition was Leofric, abbot of Peterborough, who sickened there, and came home and died soon after on the night of All Hallowmas. God honour his soul. In his day was all bliss and all good at Peterborough. He was beloved by all, so that the king gave to St. Peter and him the abbey at Burton, and that at Coventry, which Earl Leofric, who was his uncle, had formerly made, with that of Croyland, and that of Thorney. He did so much good to the minster of Peterborough, in gold, silver, and in shroud, and in land, as no other had ever done before him, nor any other after. But now was Gilden borough become a wretched borough. The monks then chose for abbot Provost Brand, because he was a good man and very wise, and sent him to Edgar Atheling, for that the land folk supposed that he should be king, and the Atheling received him gladly. When King William heard say that, he was very wroth, and said that the abbot had renounced him, but good men went between them, and reconciled them, because the abbot was a good man. He gave the king 40 marks of gold for his reconciliation, and he lived but a little while after, only 3 years, after which came all wretchedness and all evil to the minster. God have mercy on it. A.D. 1067. This year came the king back to England on St. Nicholas' Day, and the same day was burned the Church of Christ at Canterbury. Bishop Wulfrey also died, and is buried at his see in Dorchester. The child Edric and the Britons were unsettled this year, and fought with the castlemen at Hereford, and did them much harm. The king this year imposed a heavy guild upon the wretched people, but notwithstanding let his men always plunder all the country that they were over, and he then marched to Devonshire, and beset the city of Exeter 18 days. There were many of his army slain. Out he had promised them well, and performed ill, and the citizens surrendered the city, because the thanes had betrayed them. This summer child Edgar departed, with his mother Agatha, and his 2 sons, Margaret and Christina, and Merle Swain, and many good men with them, and came to Scotland under the protection of King Malcolm, who entertained them all. Then began King Malcolm to yearn after the child's sister Margaret to wife, but he and all his men long refused, and she also herself was averse, and said that she would neither have him nor anyone else, if the supreme power would grant, that she in her maidenhood might please the mighty lord with a carnal heart in his short life in pure continence. The king, however, earnestly urged her brother, until he answered yea, and indeed he durst not otherwise, for they were come into his kingdom, so that then it was fulfilled, as God had long ere foreshadowed. And else it could not be, as he himself saith in the Gospel, that not even a sparrow on the ground may fall without its foreshowing. The prescient Creator was long before what he and her would have done, for that she should increase the glory of God in this land, lead the king aright from the path of error, bend him and his people together to a better way, and suppress the bad customs which the nation formerly followed, all which she afterwards did. The king therefore received her, though it was against her will, but was pleased with her manners, and thanked God, who had in his might given him such a match. He wisely bethought himself, as he was a prudent man, and turned himself to God, renounced all impurity accordingly, as the Apostle Paul, teacher of all the gentry, saith, full oft the unbelieving husband is sanctified and healed through the believing wife, and belike the wife through the believing husband. The queen, as aforesaid, performed afterwards many useful deeds in this land of the glory of God, and also in her royal estates she well conducted herself as her nature was. Of a faithful and noble kin was she sprung. Her father was Edward Atheling, son of King Edmund. Edmund was the son of Ethelred, son of Edgar, Edgar the son of Edred, and so forth in that royal line. And her maternal kindred goeth to the Emperor Henry, who had sovereignty over Rome. This year went out Githa, Harold's mother, and the wives of many good men with her, to Flatholm, and there abode some time, and so departeth thence over to the sea at St. Almers. This Easter came the king to Winchester, and Easter was then on the 10th before the calends of April. Soon after this came the Lady Matilda hither to this land, and Archbishop Ealdred hallowed her to queen at Westminster on Whitsunday. Then it was told to the king that the people in the north had gathered themselves together and would stand against him if he came, whereupon he went to Nottingham, and wrought there a castle, and so advanced to York, and there wrought 2 castles, and the same at Lincoln, and everywhere in that quarter. Then Earl Gospatrick and the best men went into Scotland. Amidst these came out of Harold's sons from Ireland, with a naval force into the mouth of the Avon unawares, and plundered soon over all that quarter. Whence they went to Bristol, and would have stormed the town, but the people withstood them. But when they could gain nothing from the town, they went to their ships with the booty which they had acquired from plunder, and then they advanced upon Somersetshire, and there went up, and Ednoth, master of the horse, fought with them. But he was there slain, and many good men on either side. A.D. 1068. This year King William gave Earl Robert the Earldom over Northumberland, but the landsmen attacked him in the town of Durham and slew him, and 900 men with him. Soon afterwards Edgar Atheling came with all the Northumbrians to York, and the townsmen made a treaty with him. But King William came from the south unawares upon them with a large army, and put them to flight, and slew on the spot those who could not escape, which were many 100 men, and then plundered the town. St. Peter's Minster he made a profanation, and all the other places he also despoiled and trampled upon. and Atheling went back again to Scotland. After this came Harold's son from Ireland about midsummer, with 64 ships into the mouth of the Taft, where they were unwarily landed. Earl Breton came unawares against them with a large army and fought with them, and slew there all the best men that were in the fleet, and the others, being small forces, escaped to the ships, and Harold's sons went back to Ireland again. A.D. 1069. This year died Aldred, Archbishop of York, and he is there buried at his see. He died on the day of Protus and Hyacinthus, having held see which much dignity 10 years, wanting only 15 weeks. Soon after this came from Denmark 3 of the sons of King Sweyn, with 240 ships, together with Earl Esbern and Earl Thurkill, into the Humber, where they were met by the child Edgar, and Earl Waltheof, and Merle Swain, and Earl Gospatrick, with the Northumbrians and all the landsmen, riding and marching full merrily with an immense army. And so all unanimously advanced to York, where they stormed and demolished the castle, and won innumerable treasures therein, slew there many hundreds of Frenchmen, and led them with many ships. But ere the shipmen came thither, the Frenchmen had burned the city, and the holy minster of St. Peter had they entirely plundered and destroyed with fire. When the king heard this, then went he northward with all the force that he could collect, despoiling and laying waste the shire withal. Whilst the fleet lay all the winter in the Humber, the king could not come at them. The king was in York on Christmas Day, and so all the winter on the land, and came to Winchester at Easter. Bishop Egelric, who was at Peterborough, was this year betrayed, and led to Westminster, and his brother Egelwine was outlawed. This year also died Brand, abbot of Peterborough, on the 5th before the calends of December. A.D. 1070. This year Lanfranc, who was abbot of Cannes, came to England, and after a few days he became Archbishop of Canterbury. He was invested on the 4th, before the calends of September, by his own see of 8 bishops, the suffragans. The others, who were not there, by messengers and laid letter, declared that they could not. The same year Thomas, who was chosen Bishop of York, came to Canterbury, to be invested there after the ancient custom. But when Lanfranc craved confirmation of his obedience with an oath, he refused, that he ought not to do it. Whereupon Archbishop Lanfranc was wroth, and bade the bishops, who were come thither by Archbishop Lanfranc's command to do the service, and all the monks to unrobe themselves. And they, by this order, so did. Thomas therefore for the time departed without consecration. Soon after this, it happened that the Archbishop Lanfranc went to Rome, and Thomas was with him. When they came thither, and had spoken about other things which they had begun to speak about, they began Thomas with his speech, how he came to Canterbury, and how the Archbishop required obedience of him with an oath, but he declined it. Then began the Archbishop Lanfranc to show with clear distinction that he craved by right, and with strong arguments he confirmed the same before Pope Alexander, and before all the council that was collected there, and so they went home. After this came Thomas to Canterbury, and all the Archbishop required of him he humbly fulfilled, and afterwards received consecration. This year Earl Waltheof agreed with the king, but in the Lent of the same year the king ordered all the monasteries in England to be plundered. In the same year came King Sweyn from Denmark into the Humber, and the landsmen came to meet him, and made a treaty with him, thinking that he would overrun the land. Then came into Ely Christian, the Danish bishop, and Earl Osborne, the Danish domestics with him, and the English people from all the fenlands came to them, supposing that they should win the land. Then the monks of Peterborough heard say that their own men would plunder the minster, namely Hereward and his gang, because they understood that the king had given the abbacy to a French abbot, whose name was Thorold, that he was a very stern man, and was come into Stamford with all his Frenchmen. Now there was a churchwarden, whose name was Ewer, who took away by night all that he could, testaments, mass hackles, cattle copes, and reefs, and such other small things, whatsoever he could, and went early before day to the abbot Thorold, telling him that he sought his protection, and informing him how the outlaws were coming to Peterborough, and that he did all by the advice of the monks. Early in the morning came all the outlaws with many ships, resolving to enter the minster, but the monks withstood, so that they could not come in. And then they laid on fire, and burned all the houses of the monks, and all the town, except for one house. Then came they in through the fire, the bull high the gate, where the monks met them and besought peace of them. But they regarded nothing. They went into the minster, climbed up the holy rood, took away the diadem from our Lord's head, all of pure gold, and seized the bracket that was underneath his feet, which was all of red gold. They climbed up the steeple, brought down the table that was hid there, which was all of gold and silver, seized 2 golden shrines, 9 of silver, and took away 15 large crucifixes of gold and silver. In short, they seized there so much gold and silver, and so many treasures in money, raiment, and books, no man could tell another, and said that they did it from their attachment to the minster. Afterwards they went to their ships, proceeded to Ely, and deposited there all their treasure. The Danes, believing that they should overcome the Frenchmen, drove out all the monks, leaving there only one, whose name was Leofwine Lang, who lay sick in the infirmary. Then came Abbot Thorold, and 8 times 20 Frenchmen with him, all fully armed. When he came thither, he found all within and without consumed by fire, except for the church alone. But the outlaws were all with the fleet, knowing that he would come thither. This was done on the 4th day before the nones of June. The 2 kings, William and Sweyn, were now reconciled, and the Danes went out of Ely with all the aforesaid treasure, and carried it away with them. But when they came to the middle of the sea, there came a violent storm, and dispersed all the ships wherein the treasures were. Some went to Norway, some to Ireland, some to Denmark, and all that reached the latter consisted of the table, and some shrines, and some crucifixes, and many of the other treasures, which they brought to a king's town, and deposited all of them there in the church. Afterwards, through their own carelessness, and through their drunkenness, in one night the church and all that was therein was consumed by fire. Thus was the minster of Peterborough burned and plundered. Almighty God have mercy on it through great goodness. Thus came the abbot Thorold to Peterborough, and the monks too returned, and performed the service of Christ in the church, which had before stood a full week without any kind of rite. When Bishop Aelric heard it, he excommunicated all the men who that evil deed had done. There was a great famine in this year, and in the summer came the fleet in the north from the Humber into the Thames, and there lay 2 nights, and made afterwards for Denmark. Earl Baldwin also died, and his son Arnulf succeeded to the earldom. Earl William in conjunction with the King of the Franks, was to be his guardian. But Earl Robert came and slew his kinsman Arnulf the Earl, put the king to flight, and slew many thousands of his men. AD 1071. This year Earl Edwin and Earl Morcar fled out, and roamed at random in woods and fields. Then went Earl Morcar to Ely by ship, but Earl Edwin was treacherously slain by his own men. Then came Bishop Aylwine and Seward Barn, and many hundred men with them to Ely. When King William heard that, he then ordered a naval force and land force, and beset the land all about, and wrought a bridge and went in, and the naval force at the same time on the seaside. Then the outlaws surrendered. That was Bishop Aylwine, Earl Morcar, and all that were with them except Hereward alone, and all those who would join him, whom he led out triumphantly. And the king took their ships, weapons, and many treasures, and all the men he disposed of as he thought proper. Bishop Aylwine he sent to Abingdon, where he died in the beginning of the winter. AD 1072. This year King William led a naval force and a land force to Scotland, and beset that land on the seaside with ships. Whilst he led his force in at the Tweed, but he found nothing there of any value. King Malcolm, however, came and made peace with William and gave hostages, and became his man, whereupon the king returned home with all of his force. This year also died Bishop Aelric. He had been invested Bishop of York, but that see was unjustly taken from him, and he then had the bishopric of Durham given to him, which he held as long as he chose, but resigned it afterwards, and retired to Peterborough Minster, where he abode 12 years. After that King William won England. Then took he him from Peterborough, and sent him to Westminster, where he died on the Ides of October, and he is there buried within the minster, in the porch of St. Nicholas. AD 1073. This year led King William an army, English and French, over the sea, and won the district of Maine, which the English very much injured by destroying the vineyards, burning the towns, and spoiling the land. But they subdued it into the hand of King William, and afterwards returned home to England. AD 1074. This year King William went oversea to Normandy, and Child Edgar came from Flanders into Scotland on St. Grimbald's Mass Day, where King Malcolm and his sister Margaret received him with much pomp. At the same time sent Philip, the King of France, a letter to him, bidding him to come, and he would give him the castle of Montreal, that he might afterwards daily annoy his enemies. What then? King Malcolm and his sister Margaret gave him and his great men many presents and many treasures, in skins ornamented with purple, and pelisses made of marten skins and grey skins, and of ermine skins in pals and in vessels of gold and silver, and conducted him and his crew with great pomp from his territory. But in their voyage evil befell them, for when they were at sea, they came upon such strong weather, and the stormy sea and the strong wind drove them so violently on the shore that all their ships burst, and they also themselves came with great difficulty to the land. Their treasure was nearly all lost, and some of his men were also taken by the French. But he himself and his best men returned again to Scotland, some roughly travelling on foot, and some miserably mounted. Then King Malcolm advised him to send to William over sea, to request his friendship, which he did, and the king gave it to him and sent after him. Again, therefore, King Malcolm and his sister gave him all the men's numberless treasures, and again conducted him very magnificently from their territory. The Sheriff of York came to meet him at Durham, and went all the way with him, ordering meat and fodder to be found for him at every castle from which they came, until they came over the sea to the king. Then King William received him with much pomp, and he was there afterwards in his court, enjoying such rights as he confirmed to him by law. A.D. 1075. This year King William gave Earl Ralph the daughter of William Fitzosborne to wed. The same Ralph was British on his mother's side, but his father, whose name was also Ralph, was English and born in Norfolk. The king therefore gave his son the earldom of Norfolk and Suffolk, and then led the bride to Norwich. There was that bride ale, the source of man's bale. There was Earl Roger, Earl Waltheof, and bishops and abbots, who there resolved that they would drive the king out of the realm of England. But it was soon told the king in Normandy how it was determined. It was Earl Roger and Earl Ralph who were the authors of the plot, who then enticed the Britons to them, and sent eastward to Denmark after a fleet to assist them. Roger went westward to his earldom, and collected his people there, to the king's annoyance, as he thought, but it was to the great disadvantage of himself. He was, however, prevented. Ralph also in his earldom would go forth with his people, but the castlemen that were in England and also the people of the land came against him, and prevented him from doing anything. He escaped, however, to the ships at Norwich, and his wife was in the castle, which she held until peace was made with her, when she went out to England, with all her men who wished to join her. The king afterwards came to England and seized Earl Roger, his relative, and put him in prison. And Earl Waltheof went oversea, and bewrayed himself, but asked for forgiveness, and preferred gifts of ransom. The king, however, let him off lightly, until he came to England, when he had him seized. Soon after that, from the east of Denmark came 200 ships, wherein were 2 captains, Canute Swainson and Earl Harco. But they durst not maintain a fight with King William. They went rather to York and broke into St. Peter's Minster, and took therein much treasure, and so went away. They made for Flanders oversea, but they all perished who were privy to that design. That was the son of Earl Harco, and many others with him. This year died the Lady Egdtha, who was the relict of King Edward, 7 nights before Christmas at Winchester, and the king caused her to be brought to Westminster with great pomp, and he laid her with King Edward her lord. And the king was then at Westminster at midwinter, where all the Britons were condemned who were at the bride ale in Norwich. Some were punished with blindness, some were driven from the land, and some were towed to Scandinavia. And so were the traitors of King William subdued. A.D. 1076. This year died Sweyn, king of Denmark, and Harald his son took the kingdom. And the king gave his abbacy of Westminster to Abbot Vitalis, who had been the abbot of Bernay. This year was also Earl Waltheof beheaded at Winchester on the Mass Day of St. Petronilla, and his body was carried to Croyland, where he lies buried. King William now went oversea, and led his army to Brittany, and beset the castle of Dole, but the Bretons defended it, until the king came from France, whereupon William departed thence, having lost there both men and horses and many of his treasures. A.D. 1077. This year were reconciled the king of the Franks and William, king of England. but it continued only a little while. This year London was burned, one night before the Assumption of St. Mary, so terribly as it was never before since it was built. This year the moon was eclipsed 3 nights before Candlemas, and in the same year died Aelwy, the prudent abbot of Evesham, on the 14th day before the calends of March, on the Mass of St. Juliana, and Walter was appointed abbot in his stead, and Bishop Herman also died on the 10th day before the calends of March, who was bishop at Berkshire, and in Wiltshire, and in Dorsetshire. This year also King Malcolm won the mother of Mouslaith, and all his men, and all his treasures, and his castle, and he himself had not easily escaped. This year was also the dry summer, and wildfire came upon many shores and burned many towns, and also many cities were ruined thereby. A.D. 1079. This year Robert, the son of King William, deserted from his father to his uncle Robert in Flanders, because his father would not let him govern his earldom in Normandy, which he himself, and also King Philip with his permission, had given to him. The best men that were there in the land had also sworn oaths of allegiance to him and taken him for their lord. This year, therefore, Robert fought with his father, without Normandy, by a castle called Gerberoy, and wounded him in the hand, and his horse that he sat upon was killed beneath him, and that he brought him another was killed right there with a dart. That was Tukey Whitkinson. Many were there slain, and also taken. His son William, too, was there wounded, but Robert returned to Flanders. We will not here, however, record any more injury that he did to his father. This year came King Malcolm from Scotland into England, betwixt the 2 festivals of St. Mary, with a large army, which plundered Northumberland till it came to the Tyne, and slew many hundreds of men, and carried home much coin and treasure, and men in captivity. A.D. 1080. This year was Bishop Walker slain in Durham at a council, and 100 men with him, French and Flemish. He himself was born in Lorraine. This did the Northumbrians in the month of May. A.D. 1081. This year the king led an army into Wales, and there freed many hundreds of men. A.D. 1082. This year the king seized Bishop Odo, and this year also was the great famine. A.D. 1083. This year arose at the tumult of Glastonbury betwixt Abbot Thurston and his monks. It proceeded first from the abbot's want of wisdom that he misgoverned his monks in many things, but the monks meant well to him, and told him that he should govern them rightly, and love them, and they would be faithful and obedient to him. The abbot, however, would hear naught of this, but evil entreated him, and threatened them worse. One day the abbot went into the chapter house, and spoke against the monks, and attempted to mislead them, and sent after them some laymen, and they came full armed into the chapter house upon the monks. Then were the monks very much afraid of them, and wist not what they were to do, but they shot forward. Some ran into the church, and locked the doors after them, but they followed them into the minster, and resolved to drag them out, so that they durst not go out. A rueful thing happened that day. The Frenchmen broke into the choir, and hurled their weapons toward the altar where the monks were, and some of the knights went upon the upper floor, and shot their arrows downward incessantly toward the sanctuary, so that on the crucifix that stood above the altar they stuck many arrows. And the wretched monks lay about the altar, and some crept under, earnestly calling upon God, imploring his mercy, since they could not obtain any at the hands of men. What can we say? But that they continued to shoot their arrows, whilst the others broke down the doors and came in and slew some of the monks to death, and wounded many therein, so that the blood came from the altar upon the steps, and from the steps onto the floor. There 3 were slain to death, and 18 wounded. And in the same year departed Matilda, queen of King William, on the day after All Hallowmas. And in the same year also after midwinter, the king ordained a large and heavy contribution over all of England, that was, upon each hide of land, 72 pence. A.D. 1084. In this year died Wulfoald, abbot of Chertsey, on the 13th day before the calends of May. A.D. 1085. In this year men reported, and of truth asserted, that Canute the king of Denmark, son of Sweyn, was coming hither, and was resolved to win the land, with the assistance of Robert, Earl of Flanders, for Canute had Robert's daughter. When William, king of England, who was then resident in Normandy, for he had both England and Normandy, understood this, he went to England with so large an army on horse and foot from France and Brittany as never before sought the land, so that men wondered how this land could feed all of that force. But the king left the army to shift for themselves through this land amongst his subjects, who fed them, each according to his quota of land. Men suffered much distress that year, and the king caused the land to be laid waste about the sea coast, that if his foes came up, they might not have anything on him that they could readily seize. But when the king understood of a truth that his foes were impeded rather, and could not further their expedition, then he let some of his army go into their land, but some he held in his land over the winter. Then at midwinter was the king in Gloucester with his council, and held there his court 5 days, and afterwards the archbishop and clergy had a synod 3 days. There was Mauritius, chosen bishop of London, William of Norfolk, and Robert of Cheshire. These were all the king's clerks. After all this had been done, the king held a large meeting, and a very deep consultation with his council about this land, how it was occupied, and by what sort of men. Then he sent his men all over England into each shire, commissioned them to find out how many hundreds of hides were in the shire, what land the king himself had, and what stock upon the land, or what dues he ought to have been had by each year from each shire. Also he commissioned them to record in writing how much land his archbishops had, and his diocesan bishops, and his abbots and earls. And, though I may be prolix and tedious, what or how much each man had, or who was the occupier of the land in England, either in land or stock, and how much money it be worth. So very narrowly indeed did he commission them to trace out, that there was not one single hide nor yard of land. Nay, moreover, it is shameful to tell, though he thought it no shame to do it, not even an ox, or a cow, nor even a swine was left that was not set down in his writ, and all the recorded particulars were afterwards brought to him. Okay, I think we're going to end it there. So I'll thank my top tier patrons and supporters: Dark, Gary, Kimberly, Amber, Ben, Britt, Charles, Aaron, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fazabo, Legitmus, Maverick, Susan, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Cameron, Alexander, Nicholas, Daniel, JR, Charlene, Christopher, and Lynn. Thank you all so much, and I will see you in the next part of the Anglo Saxon Chronicle. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.